Privet and Spasiba. Those are about a fifth of the Russian words that I know. So I'm almost exhausted my vocabulary. But thanks for having me. Okay, so the first one I see here is, what unpublished Tolkien texts interest you as a researcher more? Well, I think most people here know that my background has primarily been in Tolkien's invented languages. So that is certainly my main area of focus. However, over the past decade or so, I've gotten much more interested as well in sort of Tolkien's metaphysics and the philosophical and theological content of his works. And that's partly, I think, why I was chosen to edit the materials that are now published in the Nature of Middle-earth. So that's a very strong second area of great interest for me with Tolkien. Yeah, I can't really think of anything else. I certainly have nothing planned other than the linguistic papers. I'm often asked how much Middle-earth material remains to be published, and the fact of the matter is that I personally am not aware of anything significant that hasn't already been published. There are versions of text that have not been published in full that could be studied, but I'm not aware of any significant essay, or certainly no act of narrative writing that hasn't been published, at least in part. Poetry, there's quite a bit of poetry that's unpublished. Some of it probably concerns Middle-earth, but most of it not. And then, of course, there's also his academic writings, which a great deal of is still unpublished, and people are starting to work on that and publish it. So there's more material to come. It's just I don't expect anything more significant to come out regarding Middle-earth. Do you think that we can treat JRRT works as postmodern? No. Postmodernism, as I understand it, I'm not a literary critic, but my understanding of postmodernism is that it questions the very existence of moral or even intellectual truths, which is very, very, very far away from what Tolkien, his thoughts and his writings. I've heard it argued that he's a modernist in the sense that he does deal with psychological themes. And to the extent that that characterizes modernism, I guess you could view him that way. My own view is he is simply himself, very much influenced by his academic background, by his religious upbringing, what he read in the classics and philosophy and well, everything. He was very widely read, much more than most people appreciate. I wouldn't lump him in with anything other than himself. What about Tolkien's philosophical texts? What philosophical concept do you adhere to? What did your work with Tolkien's philosophical texts give you? Well, I've made no secret about the fact that I am myself a devout Roman Catholic, and I'm developed an interest in what's called Aristotelian and Thomistic metaphysics, even separate from my interest in Tolkien. It's just as a personal interest. I do regard myself very much as a Thomist in that sense, and I think that's part and parcel with sort of the philosophical content of Catholicism. It's really hard to escape being, at least knowing some of the core concepts that Thomas Aquinas expressed as an educated Catholic. And as far as I can tell, Tolkien was pretty well versed with it too, and interested in it. And I think if you've read the book, particularly if you read the Appendix 1 that I put in there, I think it's pretty plain that he was in fact well versed with Thomas Aquinas. Do you plan to edit and supplement your analysis of the grammar of the Adunaic language and the Dictionary of Adunaic on the basis of Tolkien's still unpublished texts on Adunaic? I would put it the other way around. At some point, we will get to the proper place to present the remaining Adunaic material, and then we might want to revise and update, previous work that we've done. Although, frankly, I'm less inclined to do that kind of thing anymore. My time is better spent just getting the the unpublished text edited and published and leave the analysis to other people. Something actually I would really like to see more of with the material that's already been published. There's numerous thick volumes of Parma El Lambaron and numerous issues of Vinyar Tengwar that have been already published. And it seems like hardly anybody is doing any work with that material that's already been published. They just all they want to know is when's the next batch. Well, you got a lot to work with right now. So have at it. It's a little, I won't say depressing, because that's not really the right word, but it always makes me a little bit sad when we publish something new and all that people do is go through and look for new vocabulary and add it to their vocabulary lists. That's, that I don't mind people doing that, but there's more to be done than just that. It's as though all we're doing is publishing interesting new vocabulary for people. But our work is much, much more than that. In these unpublished texts, is there Adonaic grammar, conjugation of verbs, or Tolkien's dictionary of Adonaic? And there's no dictionary. He never compiled a dictionary of Adonaic. I don't honestly, off the top of my head, remember what the grammatical content of this material that I'm talking about. It's been a while since I looked at it personally. There will certainly be some additional, information about Adonaic and how it works in this material. But again, it's not a whole lot. Will Vinyar Tengwar and Parma El Lambaron magazines continue to be published? Yes. Should we wait for new issues soon? I know that there's a new issue of Parma in the works as we speak. I myself have taken a little break after I finished my book. But when I do pick up the language papers again, my first plan is to work on the material for Taliska, which is a much more extensive Mannish language than Adonaic. Tolkien wrote a lot more about it than he wrote about Adonaic. So that's my immediate plans. And at some point, yes, I do plan to carry on with Vinyar Tengwar. The situation's sort of shifting a bit, though, because VT started out as a newsletter for the Elvish Linguistic Fellowship. It grew to contain shorter, unpublished text with some analysis in it. So I'm going to have to think about what I was doing with VT, whether it still makes sense to do that in that format, as opposed to working on things to publish in Parma, which is a larger format. So we'll see. But yes, we continue to work on the materials, and there will be more to come. Is it possible to say we have enough linguistic works and related materials? Enough for what? I mean, enough to spend quite a bit of time working on and explicating and understanding deeper? Absolutely. Enough in the sense that we've published everything? No, we haven't. So in that sense, there's not enough. I see what the point of this question is. Why not create a separate volume of linguistics or languages of Middle-earth? Because that's essentially what we're doing in Parma. Because you can't just to do what I think the questioner is asking us to do. It would be to sort of like pick and choose amongst various versions of Tolkien's grammars and decide and form it all into one single coherent language or languages. Tolkien never did that. I'm not about to do that. My job is to publish what he wrote. I don't personally have any interest in creating a synthesis of all this material and publishing it. Let's see. Are there any plans to release official dictionaries for Middle-earth? None that I know. Well, it depends what you mean by official. If you mean is the Tolkien estate doing that, they've never mentioned that to me. I don't have any plans to do that. It seems to me a lot of people have taken it upon themselves to create just that online. How do you assess the general level of Tolkienology research these days, and that of the younger generation searchers in particular? Do you think it is necessary to create departments of Tolkienology or help academic Tolkienology in any way? Reading and criticizing Tolkien, I'd say it's very active, probably more active now than it's been in any other time of my life. And that's in large part because pioneers like Verlin Flieger, Tom Shippey have, really blazed a trail, made it respectable, even in the academic setting, to study Tolkien seriously and write about him seriously. So all that's great. As with everything else, though, there's a lot of junk out there too. And one thing I personally, I wasn't really asked this directly, I'd say, but what I'm concerned about is Tolkien being subjected to what they call critical theory, where you got to see everything through the lens of race or class or gender, whatever, which I have no objection to people doing that. If they find value in doing that and they find other people who are interested in that, who value it as well, that's great. Have at it. But I personally don't think that Tolkien is the type of author who is really susceptible to viewing his literary writings through such critical lenses like that. And I'd really love to see more work on appreciating Tolkien's prose style. I think most every one of us here who reads Tolkien in English, at least, recognizes a passage written by Tolkien. It has a certain characteristic feel about it that I've never tried to put my finger on exactly, because again, I'm not a literary critic. But I'm sure if I spent more time thinking about it and studying it seriously, I could come up with some, better ways to characterize his writing. But nonetheless, I think we all feel it. We know it's there. We know there's something distinctive about Tolkien's prose. Well, I'd love to see more serious attention paid to understanding that. I think Michael Drought has done a little bit of that work. He was certainly heading that way. I haven't seen anything lately from him on that. I think there's a lot to do there. Is it necessary to create departments? No. I think English departments are probably struggling enough these days that to carve out Tolkien and put him into his own department would be disastrous to English. And I don't think Tolkien would be happy about that. It should be incorporated into English studies and medieval studies, for that matter. What do you think of Amazon's Lord of the Rings series? Like everyone else, we'll just have to wait and see. The worst thing they could do in my mind is to try to make it like Game of Thrones, because again, that is inappropriate to Tolkien. But I'll withhold judgment until we see the results. Do you think that Tolkien will be the next victim of cancel culture for his various sins of conservative Catholicism? Certainly that's potentially the case, yeah. I think he's shielded from it a bit because academic English departments in particular realize how valuable Tolkien is to them in terms of getting people in seats. But if that ceases to be the case, I expect that, yes, there will be a sort of an effort to cancel Tolkien. We'll see. I hope it doesn't come to that. How, in your opinion, does the cosmology of Arda and the chronology of the First Age described in the myths Transformed and the nature of Middle Earth match with the one described in the Silmarillion? Not well. Tolkien later in his life, after finishing Lord of the Rings, as most of you know, I'm sure, decided he didn't like the flat world myth anymore, that the world, of course, the world had to always be a globe, and the sun and the moon were always there and coeval with the earth. And to a large extent, he spent the rest of his life hemming and hawing over that decision. He knew, for whatever reason, he thought that really had to be the case. But he also, I think, recognized that if he carried that out, it would absolutely destroy his mythology and his distinctives, like the two trees and the sun and the moon being the fruits of the two trees after they're killed, this kind of thing. That's beautiful. And to remove that would reduce everything else, the Silmarils, everything, to greatly reduce their significance and rob Tolkien of his the distinctives of his mythology. So they don't match well at all. I'm very, very glad that Christopher Tolkien did not adopt that late view of things for the published Silmarillion. And I'm very glad that Tolkien, in fact, never did carry through all the changes. We're very lucky. I've made this point before too. I'll make it here again. I have found over the years that I've come to decide that I'm very glad that Tolkien never finished the Silmarillion, because if he had, and even setting aside possibly disastrous decisions like the whole thing about the round earth, if he had done that, we would never have gotten the History of Middle-earth series. If he had finished it, there would be no reason to publish the whole of the History of Middle-earth. And what a loss that would be, because now we get to see how Tolkien developed as a writer and a thinker over time, which would not have been possible had he completed the Silmarillion, I feel. What about historical etymology? An attempt to track the history of language development and the history of the evolution of thought inside Tolkien's head based on particular word roots and stems. Yeah, we do that. That's what we do. In the not just myself or my colleagues in the ELF, but basically most people who are seriously interested in studying Tolkien's languages engage in just that. They look at what the languages and their relatedness tell us about their fictive development, both real world and Tolkien's development of them, as well as the in-world historical development that they demonstrate. Which roots show it better? Can we do it for all known root stems describing how they changed in each period of time? Probably not all of them. Sometimes there's just not going to be enough information, comparative information to work out that kind of thing. But yeah, a lot of them you can. That's one of the great things about doing working on Tolkien's languages. In fact, before I even discovered Tolkien, I had become interested in what's now called historical and comparative linguistics, or in Tolkien's time, philology. And I loved to study how, for example, English developed from Middle English, from Old English to Germanic to Indo-European, right? It was fascinating to me that you could do that. You could actually, almost like a time machine, you could look back in time through the lens of words. However, by the time I came along in, the mid-70s and started to develop this interest, a lot of the work that I really especially enjoyed had already been done for the Germanic languages, and that was my main area of interest. So I was delighted to discover that you could apply those same methods, the comparative methods, and trace the phonological development of Tolkien's languages, and that work had not been all done. So I thought, oh, this is great. Now I can use the techniques that I enjoy, apply to these relatively not fully studied languages, and have fun. So that's how I got into it. Is it possible to understand the materials of the nature of Middle-earth, that the star called Venus was in the sky before Eärendil was ascended there, and afterwards only was named in his honor? Yes, that is very much the case that Tolkien came to adopt. The view that he came to adopt later in life was that Venus was just always a planet like any other planet. I don't remember to what level of detail Tolkien worked out what that change would mean for the myth of Eärendil. Surprisingly, as Verlin Flieger has pointed out recently, the whole myth of Eärendil is, even though we all know the story, is only sketched by Tolkien. It's very underdeveloped. And I don't recall him specifically dealing with the effect of that view on the Eärendil myth. How is the name change related to the evolution of Tolkien's texts? Was it difficult for you to deal with texts full of character names and other terms changing throughout a time during a text evolution? Actually, it's very useful because when you can sort of determine when a certain change of a name took place, then if you look at another text that has the later form of the name, then it had to have been written after that point in time. If it has the earlier form of the name, then you can be pretty sure that it was written before that time. So it's actually really, really helpful. this is something I was turning to the index to the history of Middle Earth constantly to see when certain forms first arose. And then that, I mean, and not just for Nature of Middle Earth, but all the texts that we work with, including the linguistic texts. You can use this internal evidence to figure out roughly when some text was written, because Tolkien very, very rarely ever wrote a date on anything. You've mentioned the unpublished poetry. That's exactly what I wanted to ask you about. In Volume 3 of History of Middle Earth, there are extracts from the Lay of the Fall of Gondolin rhyming, and it was mentioned that the rest of the poem is to be found elsewhere, quote, elsewhere. There are extracts of the Old Bridge of Taberbel in John Garth's book, Tolkien and the Great War. Is there any chance of the complete text to be available one day? Sure, one day. A lot of people working with Tolkien have full-time jobs. You know, they don't do this for a living. It's the handful of academics that are treating with Tolkien seriously are fortunate in that respect when they can do it as part of their job. Most of us don't have that luxury. So I myself am in my 37th year of working for NASA. And believe you me, that's a challenging day job and doesn't leave much time most days for me to work on anything. I'm usually too tired or just want to switch my mind off by the time I end my workday. I do hope to retire within a couple of years, though, so that's going to change one of these days. There are poems we know by the titles only, like The Trumpets of Faerie or The Companions of the Rose. Is there any chance you might get them published? Me? No. Will they be published someday? Yes, I'm quite certain of that. Have you ever thought of editing a volume of Tolkien's poetry comprising all these and much more than these? Not myself, but I'm not the only one who's working with Tolkien's papers. I'll just leave that there for now. What about the grammar of the Elvish languages, which has been changed several times by JRT himself during his work with it, while he has been coming up with it? Is it possible to make an analysis based on Tolkien's diaries? I've never seen the diaries. Very few people have outside of the Tolkien family. I'm not sure that anyone has, other than I'm sure the archivist there, Bodleian has seen them. The Tolkien family is private. They protect their privacy, and I respect that. The only part of it that I have seen was when my colleague Arden Smith was working on the Rumilian alphabet. Christopher Tolkien transcribed, I believe, some samples of because Tolkien kept his diary in the Rumilian alphabet to make this make sense. So Christopher Tolkien did supply some samples of words just so Arden could characterize whether and how it differed from what was in the linguistic papers themselves. And again, because we know when the diaries were written, that tells us something about the date when Tolkien was working on, that particular form of Vermilion. So Christopher Tolkien was always extremely accommodating to us in our work, but that shows how seriously he protects the privacy. He didn't just make photocopies of it and send it to us. He took the time to transcribe words for our use. And I respect that fully. You recently talked about unpublished notes by JRT on the Kuzdual phonology, Dwarven languages. Can you tell us more about it? No, because A, I wouldn't have permission to, and B, frankly, that's never been my particular focus. And so I couldn't remember with any certainty what, anything that is in the written materials, which is very small, much smaller even than what we have for Adonaic, which is pretty small. But yes, there is a little bit more to be published on Kuzdual, and we'll get to it one of these days. But it's not going to revolutionize anything, I can tell you that. What languages do you think Kuzdual is similar to? Well, obviously, it's, as Tolkien himself says, it's built on a Semitic basis. So it's got the three-letter roots, and then function or meaning of words is derived and varied by varying the vowels that occupy, that either between any two of the letters or at the end of the word or at the beginning of the word. Basically, unlike Indo-European, for example, where we have a root to which various endings are applied, or at least that's originally how it was varied for meaning. In the Semitic languages, you have the same three letters. That's the root consonants, three consonants, and then it's just how you vary the vowels in the words that determines their meaning. And Adunaic is very similar too, by the way, which also, again, it's clearly Semitic basis. In structure, not really, I don't think in detail. In other words, the way you express some grammatical meaning in Hebrew is not going to be the same as you would do it in Adunaic. What do you think about contemporary research of Middle Earth languages? How can you rate it? What notable works or researchers can you recommend? Well, I'm obviously a little biased for my own online journal called Tenguestier. That reminds me, I've got two articles that I'm waiting to be published on that. I'm really pleased with, it hasn't been a lot of work, but I'm really pleased with the quality of the work that people have submitted to that. It's certainly it's the kind of research that most interests me. Actually seriously looking at what Tolkien had to say about his languages and working out the implications and studying the details closely and seeing what you can discover by doing so. That being said, I don't see a lot of that happening online. There was a shift somewhere along the line where all of the discussion of Tolkien basically moved online, which is understandable. It's very convenient. It's global in reach. But once that started to happen with Tolkien's languages, the actual close study and research of the languages all but vanished. Most of the effort was spent people trying to figure out how to translate something into Elvish, which again is fine, but it's not the kind of work that interests me. I'd really like to see more of what we used to have back in the print-only days, where there was much more back and forth, people proposing various things in articles, people replying to those proposals, discussing them. I just don't see that happening online. If I'm missing something online, please somebody point me to it. But I've looked around quite a bit, and I just don't see the kinds of discussion that we used to have taking place anymore. What notable works or researchers can you recommend from web enthusiasts to university departments, any level? Recommend. Well, it depends. So, for example, if you just want to get a free and somewhat extensive look at Tolkien's languages in general, how they relate to one another, get a sense of the grammar, or at least at particular points in Tolkien's development of them. Ardalambion is a great site for that, no question about it. It's gotten pretty seriously out of date by this point, but still, for somebody who just wants to try to come to understand what this is all about, it's a great resource. Are you interested in other artificial languages, for example, Esperanto? Not really. I think Esperanto is pretty neat. I have looked at it a bit, and actually two of my colleagues, Arden Smith and Patrick Wynn, can converse with each other in Esperanto quite readily. I've never felt the urge to try to, actually learn to read it or speak it. I can appreciate it intellectually. I do have an appreciation for the sound of Esperanto, but I just don't have the time to spend, to really learn how to read and speak it. I'm much more interested in real world languages. If I'm going to devote my brain to learning a language, I prefer it to be a real world language that I might actually use. Unfortunately, I'm not very good at that either. I know a little bit of German. I would get by in Germany. I know even less Japanese, but I wouldn't starve to death. Of the actually contemporary spoken languages, those are the two I know the most about and have the most interest in. Other than that, it's been a lot of dead languages, Old English, Middle English. I did read a Welsh grammar, but I don't speak it. I can't really even read Welsh, not without a dictionary and a grammar to hand. I have an appreciation for Welsh, for its grammatical, the way its grammar works, the sound of Welsh, the history of Welsh words and such. That all fascinates me, but I've never made a serious attempt to learn to speak it as much as I'd like to. Do you know about further development of Middle-earth nature after the elves leave and the men stay alone? Nothing other than what, Tolkien has written about it, which is not very much. I mean, he did make that abortive attempt to write a sequel to The Lord of the Rings, which quickly went nowhere, and I think he just became bored with it, frankly. I'm really not aware of any extensive writings by him about what happened after the, in the Fourth Age. And beyond, other than at some point, within the fiction, it obviously becomes it is our world. So we pick up history. Our history picks up somewhere along the line. I think Tolkien said somewhere it was about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. I think that expanded. And if you read the history of the nature of Middle Earth, you'll see that time period expanded considerably in his later writings. Did Tolkien have any vision about the Ents or the Great Eagles other than what's been published? I'm unaware of any other writings about them. What do you think of their future fate? I assume you mean of the Ents and the Eagles. Well, the Eagles at least were servants of Manwë, so presumably they went with Manwë when Valinor was taken off of the physical world. Let's see, the Ents. No, I'm not aware of him writing anything more about them. It's kind of sad. Tolkien writes that about the hobbits, that they basically shrunk and became almost like wild creatures. I mean, they were sentient human, but they lived in the wild and came to be hunted by men later on. This is in the nature of Middle Earth as well. Very sad, grim fate. I don't know if Tolkien maybe envisions a similarly grim fate for the Ents. Were there any unexpected discoveries for you during your work on nature of Middle Earth? Yes, many. The first one in the book would be that Tolkien imagined in the 50s that the Easterry, the wizards, and Melion were also sent to guard the elves at Cuiviény, in addition to Orome. That was pretty fascinating. Oh, and then, of course, the big one that I always mention, gets mentioned a lot, is the whole Dancing Bears festival in Numenor, which I'll never forget the first time I read that. It's like, what? Yeah, and there are others. There's a lot of nice little surprises and nuggets in this book. A word about the book, I should say. I don't know how many here have had a chance to even get a copy of it, let alone read it. But I've made this comment elsewhere too. It's not the kind of book that you have to read from cover to cover. You can dip around in it. Most of the material is short chapters, and the subject matter varies considerably. I've tried to arrange them in a way that I think makes sense and group certain types of texts or topics together. But even within the sections, the three main parts, you don't have to read from start to finish. Dip around. There's lots to discover. I would also say this too. I know the first part of the book is math heavy, and there's lots of tables and calculations and such. Unless you're the kind of person who's really interested in learning those kinds of details and want to see Tolkien in action and coming up with those kinds of details, you really don't have to go through all those tables and such. But I do encourage you to read any text that accompanies those tables, because you will very often find some really interesting tidbits, like what I just said about the Easterry and Melion being sent to guard the elves. JRT concept of fate and free will had been changing throughout time, even to the idea of true reincarnation. What do you think about the evolution of encircled souls phenomena in JRRT works? Okay, people have long had, I think, the mistaken idea that elves that only men had free will. And that's simply not true. It couldn't be true. The real difference between men and elves, apart from the fact that men are mortal and elves are not, is that when elves die, their body dies, their soul nonetheless stays in Middle Earth. In that sense, men are freer than elves, because when they die, their souls go beyond this, what Tolkien calls the circles of the world. To what fate they in the Third Age, of course, don't know. Tolkien has an answer for that and his own personal faith, of course. But to me, that's what Tolkien is really getting at when he talks about the freedom that men have that elves do not. It doesn't have anything to do with their will. It doesn't have anything to do with being constrained to the music per se. As Tolkien explains, everybody in the material world is subject to fate in the sense of the given circumstances that we live in. There are things that we cannot change and had no part in making. In that sense, we all are subject to fate. But what he does say is that within those given circumstances, we do have freedom to make choices about what we do in those circumstances and how we react as events occur or people enter our lives, et cetera, et cetera. Clearly, elves have the same freedom in that regard that men do. Otherwise, they would be like Aule's initial dwarves. They would just be automata, only able to do whatever some other rational mind is willing them to do at any time. I've never bought into that idea that only men have free will. And Tolkien is quite explicit that that's not the case in the essay on fate and free will that's included in The Nature of Middle-earth. What do you think about the Fea and Hroa separation process resulting in zombie-like creatures? Yeah, that was spooky. I think it was a thought that made Tolkien quickly uncomfortable. It was interesting. I mean, it shows how he thinks through the implications of what he's writing. But it's obvious. I got the sense that it wasn't something that Tolkien was particularly comfortable writing about. So what Tolkien linguistic texts after Taliska materials will be next to publish in Parma, Eldalamberon, and Vinar Tengwar? I couldn't tell you what's going to be next in VT, and I won't tell you what's coming up in Parma because I'm not the editor and that's not for me to announce. But I think if you look at the course of the recent issues of Parma, you can see where it's heading. What do you think about influence of Chesterton's books or ideas could have on Tolkien? Or maybe they could have similar ideas just because they lived at the same time. Well, I mean, Chesterton is very famously a Catholic convert. And a very serious Catholic writer. So they certainly do have that in common. In terms of influence of Chesterton's style or the themes he wrote about on Tolkien, I'm not really well enough read in Chesterton to say for sure, but my sense is that they're not very similar. I mean, Tolkien obviously did enjoy Chesterton's writings, no doubt about that. Will Tolkien's works ever go into the public domain? Well, sure, eventually. If recognizing Tolkien's text is hard and difficult work, it may be better to involve assistants who are familiar with recognizing Tolkien's manuscripts, Wayne Hammond, Christina Scull, John Ratliff. You could also involve to help with the work on Tolkien's linguistic manuscripts, several famous researchers of languages of Arda, and they list them here. When 2 or 3 or more people are working on text, this can greatly facilitate the work itself and bring the publication of the text closer. The first misapprehension here is that it's a matter of short time to become able to read Tolkien's handwriting and to read it across the decades and the many different styles of his handwriting. I myself made big improvements in my abilities to read Tolkien's writing just by working on The Nature of Middle-earth. Okay. So I've been at this for 30 years and there was a lot of room for improvement. Now I do actually have a work that's going to be published in a volume this summer, I think, that I've sort of distilled what I've learned down and created a table of some of Tolkien's idiosyncrasies in his handwriting that is going to be put up on the web so that other people can go through these tables and try to figure out, what's this word or what letter is this probably? Okay, because it's not simple at all. It's even more difficult when you throw in the fact that he's talking about an invented language. If he was only ever writing English words, that's one thing, because you can usually tell from context, what a word, even though if it's in and of itself isn't clear, you can usually figure out what's intended. That's not the case with invented language elements. Now, fortunately, Tolkien tends generally to be more careful when writing words, for example, in the Elvish languages, but not always. And there's the other issue that the few times that we have shared any of this material that was entrusted to us by the Tolkien estate, whenever we shared any of it to anyone outside of our group, it very quickly went public. And, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So that is never going to happen again. The Tolkien estate, would never permit it at this point for this material to go out of our hands to anyone else, because the people that have been shown this material have instantly betrayed that trust. It's not going to happen again. So that's it, I think. Thank you very much for having me. Spasibo.